Joining me now, Marc Morial, President and CEO of the National Urban League and former mayor of New Orleans, and Democratic Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who as a young civil rights activist helped organize the March on Washington and other events in Dr. King's life. Welcome both. Congresswoman.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mayor Morial, and to both of you. Thinking back, we all remember where we were. You were an organizer in the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee with Dr. King. What Vernon Jordan was remembering there when he said we all knew he was going to be great. They were kids together in Atlanta. They were in the same neighborhood growing up. Think back to those days.
Well, we might have thought we were young people, but this man, this preacher, was barely older than we were. Yes, we were college students when he was assassinated. He was only 39 years old. And yet, his extraordinary leadership, his gravitas, made him seem an elder. And yes, an elder in the civil rights movement. But Andrea, remember, as we look back on his life, his vision of social justice was so broad that even after he led in accomplishing the 3 great civil rights acts, his vision stretched to poverty, to the Vietnam War early, when most people thought it was all right. His vision was so broad that in a real sense, we are simply remembering today the highlight of it. We're not remembering his entire vision and some of the sadness that he was not able to accomplish that whole vision.
And in fact, Marc Morial, as Congresswoman Norton just alluded to, in those years of 67, 68, he was so controversial. He was going up against Lyndon Johnson in the Vietnam War and what was an accepted wisdom, conventional wisdom. And his march with the sanitation workers in Memphis was popular nationally. So he was struggling, and he really reflected that in his final sermon the night before he died, that he wouldn't reach the mountaintop. He'd seen the mountaintop, but he wouldn't get to the promised land himself.
I was 10 years old when Dr. King was assassinated, and remember the reaction of my mother and father of horror, disbelief, and anger. But as you mentioned, Andrea, at that point in 1967, Dr. King had made 2 distinct, if you will, expansions of his message and his work, transitioning from civil rights to human rights. And it included the Poor People's Campaign for Economic Justice, which was launched in late 67 and early 1968. And his decision exactly 1 year before his death on April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Baptist Church to break with President Johnson in opposition to the war in Vietnam. And those steps meant that Martin Luther King was no longer confining himself to solely racial justice, but saw racial justice as part of an expanded effort for human rights. It was at the inception of that work, which the Memphis campaign was all about, that he was assassinated. And I think that means that today we've got to renew this fire and passion for economic justice.
And that's such an important reminder, and I know you're there, and we hear the sound of the memorial service, which has just started this hour, there at the Lorraine Motel, which is now a museum. So when we talk about his legacy, it's the unfinished business, it's how he himself was in transition. We see him now as the great monument on the ellipse here across from the Jefferson Memorial. But that's not who Dr. King was at his death. I was a young reporter, and I had just worked writing a story about his final speech, the final sermon, when we heard about the assassination. And immediately in the city of Philadelphia, of course, there was, widespread agony, grief, protest, and running out to collect interviews my first year as a reporter, to see that, and then thinking about Indianapolis and that night with Bobby Kennedy, and then in June, his death, 1968, was just an overwhelming degree of sadness. It was 3 assassinations in one decade. The decade shook us in so many ways, and it was the decade of social action in a way we had not seen before or after. You would have thought Martin Luther King saw
the 1964 Civil Rights Act, job discrimination, all the rest, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. If you are a civil rights leader and you've accomplished that, to be sure, the Fair Housing Act didn't get acted until shortly after, and because of his assassination. But you saw the two great civil rights bills in 100 years come out of your work. Seems to me you would have said, well done. But look what he did. He was discontented with that vision of justice. And I don't think we've seen a leader like him who didn't understand, rest on your laurels and go drink from that well. Instead, he took enormous risks in being among the first to come out against the Vietnam War. In going after poverty, which we're still trying to conquer today, and are finding young people having to take 2 or 3 jobs, often even after a college education, going after what is the greatest challenge of American capitalism, when you've already accomplished something that no man or woman had accomplished. It tells you that he was willing to risk everything for social justice, and he knew it because he virtually saw his own assassination in his last words in that last sermon.
I mean, it's amazing that prediction. Marc Morial, as the former mayor of a city, you've seen it all.
Yeah, I would add one thing, Andrea, that I think is really critical to understanding the Poor People's Campaign and the fight for economic justice. It was an intentional effort by Dr. King to bring together poor whites, poor blacks, and poor Latinos. He saw the Poor People's Campaign as multiracial in its dimension, and I think we have to recognize that that provides for us today a blueprint and a roadmap about what the current fight for economic justice needs to be about.
Well, thank you.